Good afternoon. My name is Siobhan Hedgepeth, and I will read the land acknowledgement. Every community owes its existence and strength to the generations before them around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy into making the history that led to this moment. Truth and acknowledgement are critical in building mutual respect and connections across all barriers of heritage and difference. So, we acknowledge the truth that is often buried. We are on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway people, who are the ancestral stewards of this sacred land. It is their historical responsibility to advocate for the four-legged, the winged, those that crawl, and those that swim. They remind us that clean air and pristine waterways are essential to all life. This land acknowledgement is a vocal reminder for each of us as two-leggeds to ensure our physical environment is in better condition than what we inherited, for the health and prosperity of future generations.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adele H. I am the University Archivist and co-chair for the 1856 Project. We are honored to have this amazing community join us this afternoon for the 1856 Project's inaugural symposium. Today's event is a culmination of so many voices that believe and understand the value of this work, and we remain humbled by your presence and all those that labored to bring us here today. At this time, I would like to share remarks from our university president, Dr. Darryll Pines.
Good day, everyone. My name is Darryll Pines, and I'm the president of the University of Maryland. And it's my honor to welcome you to campus and to the inaugural 1856 Project Symposium. This is an important step in the University of Maryland's efforts to fully understand its past institutional ties to slavery and the slave trade, as well as uncovering, documenting, and sharing the stories of our Black ancestors and contemporary community. Each of you has my heartfelt thanks and appreciation for this critical work that you are doing. From Frederick Douglass to Perrin Mitchell, the statues and buildings on our campus seek to honor our diverse trailblazers and reflect our ideals of equality, equity, and justice. The 1856 Project is the latest effort to acknowledge where the university has fallen short in the past while also mapping a course fearlessly forward together for our future. Elaine Johnson Coates, the first African-American woman to earn an undergraduate degree at the University of Maryland, once said, "There will be no finite end to my journey." It is that spirit of ongoing strength that we continue our search for justice and work each day to ensure a bright and successful future for all of us.
Thank you, Dr. Pines, for those generous remarks. And now I would like to pass the mic to my colleague, Dr. Joni Floyd. She is the curator for Maryland Historical Collections and the co-chair and my co-conspirator for the 1856 Project.
Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me all right? Okay. We welcome you here today during a time when many may be feeling untethered. Most recently, the killing of Tyree Nichols by Memphis police, whose funeral is today, and mass shootings in California have us reeling in the face of atrocious violence. How do we conceptualize what is happening around us? We ground ourselves in our histories, the as told to, the contested, the stranger than fiction, the messy, and the incomplete. We ground ourselves to our narratives, stories shared in our families, whispered in our communities, shouted from our pulpits, and studied in our classrooms. The 1856 Project seeks to ground our campus community in the history of our campus that includes and informs us all. The symposium brings together today students, faculty, public historians, and community scholars to discuss ongoing research into how slavery in Maryland and at the University of Maryland defines our shared past and continues to shape our present. Like other university studying slavery chapters from Maryland here today, the University of Maryland is committed to supporting research in this area and with engaging with its own history in order to steward our legacy toward one as an institution committed to equity, inclusion, and social justice. Today's first session is the 1856 Project in Context. Moderating this session is the Dean of University Libraries, Dr. Adriene Lynn.
Welcome again, everyone, to this exciting symposium, and thank you for the kind introduction, Dr. Floyd. As Joni said, I'm Adriene Lim, Dean of Libraries, and I'm very excited to be here with you today for the inaugural symposium of the 1856 Project. Not only do I have the humbling honor of witnessing the many ways in which UMD colleagues and other community members, the passion and deep scholarly work, the expertise that made this event possible, but now I've been given that special honor of introducing our esteemed keynote speaker today. We are very fortunate to have Ms. Mary Elliott here with us today to share her vast knowledge and insights with us. In particular, her knowledge about the history of the enslavement of Africans and African Americans in the United States, and how, despite the horrors of enslavement, Black people, enslaved and free, created kinships, communities, and networks. Her keynote will also address why it continues to be important to research, write, and discuss slavery. Ms. Elliott, or Mary, as she would like me to call her, is curator of American slavery at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. She curated the museum's Slavery and Freedom inaugural exhibit. Hopefully many of you were able to see that. It was astounding. She is the inaugural curator and content developer for the museum's award-winning digital humanities feature, The Searchable Museum. And she wrote the special broadsheet section of the award-winning New York Times featured publication entitled The 1619 Project. Mary is a graduate of Howard University and the Catholic University of America's Columbus School of Law. Prior to her work at the Smithsonian, she helped produce many local history exhibits and public education programs, working with various organizations, including the National Visionary Leadership Project, the Humanities Council of Washington, D.C., the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, and the Reginald Lewis Museum of Maryland African American History. Please help me welcome our distinguished keynote speaker, Mary Elliott.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here today. And thank you to the University of Maryland and to the 1856 Project team. It's a really exciting time. You could feel the excitement just walking into the building. And also thank you to the Pine Fund for really supporting this project. Today I'm going to talk to you about the history of slavery a little bit in Maryland, and also talk about the work that I've done working with the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, looking at history in communities, doing community engagement, and why that's important, an important aspect of this 1856 project. But not only that, why the 1856 project is important, not just for we need to know this history, but what that knowing that history will do for us. So you can go to the next slide. As you've heard, I've worked at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and while I would love to say that I did that exhibition all by myself, I had the honor of working with my co-curator, Nancy Barkaw, who is brilliant, and she is currently working with the National Museum of American History. The museum opened in 1916, and we're still growing strong, having over 8 million visitors to date. If you'll go to the next slide, please. I wanted to touch on our vision because I'm going to touch on the vision in a little bit about the 1856 project as well. So our vision includes to explore and celebrate African American history, culture, and community. We look at the history of America through the African American narrative as a lens to provide a more nuanced and powerful understanding of the American experience. And we look at this in international context, and this is very important. We want to serve as a 21st century model for collaboration, dialogue, and reconciliation. Next slide, please. So my title for my presentation today, you notice that it says for support and advancement. That actually is an excerpt from a will that is featured on the wall in the Slavery and Freedom exhibition at the museum. The excerpt is from a woman who bequeaths to her son for his support and advancement 2 enslaved children. We culled down the excerpt so it would fit on the wall. Those 2 children, the young girl was 4 years old and the little boy was 6 years old. But after that bequeathing these 2 children, it also says in the document, and their future increase. So I want you to think about that. For your support and advancement, I give to you these 2 enslaved children and their future increase. You can imagine the legacy of wealth and opportunity and access for that young man who acquired this human property, and then what became of those 2 children. This is an image, if you go back, that was an image of Charles Calvert, the 5th Lord of Baltimore, and with him is an enslaved young man. And so I wanted to set that picture in your mind, thinking about the words in the will. These are not unusual words. These words show up in wills throughout the period. And we'll go to the next slide. So I wanted to talk about the Mid-Atlantic region and the beginnings of slavery. And we think about Virginia and the first shipment of enslaved people of African descent brought into the English colonies in 1619 in Virginia. And then in 1626, a shipment of enslaved African people brought into New Netherlands by the Dutch West India Company. And then in 1642, you have a shipment of enslaved African people brought into Maryland. Chattel slavery was instituted in Virginia. You see laws where they start to indicate that children born of enslaved women inherit the status of their mother. And we also see laws restricting access to land, voting, use of firearms, movement, freedom. Laws require people to actively engage in enslavement through the various iterations of the Fugitive Slave Acts. And non-compliance is met with incarceration or a fine. We also see rebellions taking place during this time, and what's important to note, I always emphasize this is not just a story about slavery, it's a story about slavery and freedom, always in tandem. And so you think about these rebellions taking place and the reaction following such rebellions, the laws that start to come into play afterwards. Thinking about Maryland, this is just a brief timeline I wanted to share with you. And of course, looking at the establishment of St. Mary's City in southern Maryland. We look at the laws prohibiting miscegenation. The Maryland General Assembly legalizes slavery. As I mentioned, 1642 was also the year that the first shipment of enslaved African people were brought into the area. We look at the ban on the importation of enslaved African people into the colony well before 1807. And we look at 1789 and the efforts of abolitionists in the region, and also declaring that free black men cannot vote in 1802. 1816, outlawing manumission by deed or will, and by 1864, finally, we have the abolition of slavery in Maryland. Of course, I could talk about Maryland being a border state, not leaving the Union, but maintaining both enslavement and freedom at the same time. So we'll go to the next slide, please. I want to point out a few things about Maryland using some of the collections and images from the collection at the museum, the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Here we have a portrait of John Westwood, which was painted by Joshua Johnson. Joshua Johnson was a young man who was enslaved and gained his freedom and ultimately became a well-known portrait maker in Baltimore, in the Baltimore area. We also have this portrait of Mother Elizabeth Lang, who is the founder of the Oblate Order of Sisters in Maryland, and Maryland, of course, being that Catholic colony, right? And so thinking about this woman of Haitian descent who was able to create this experience for young women even before slavery was abolished in the state. We'll go to the next slide, please. Of course, we can't talk about Maryland without talking about the iconic Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, both freedom fighters. But knowing them and their stories about the escape from enslavement and the fight for freedom, and how freedom was not a selfish act, freedom was for themselves as well as for others. Harriet Tubman making several trips back down to Maryland to free her family and friends. And then, of course, Frederick Douglass, a constant battle for freedom for all, as he used his voice as a resource, as well as his access to be able to produce newspapers to constantly promote the notion of freedom for all. We have this ambrotype of Frederick Douglass in our collection, as well as one of the earliest known images of Harriet Tubman, which we're really honored to be able to share that in our collection with the Library of Congress. Next slide, please. So I want to talk about the power of place, because Maryland is so powerfully positioned, being right there next to Virginia, right next to Pennsylvania, and to the District of Columbia. While we were out collecting objects, some of the things that we did to prepare for the opening of the museum, we talked with many different community groups, including communities in Hagerstown. And one of the things that was very powerful when we were looking at what we believe to be the auction block from the Hagerstown courthouse is the discussion about how in that particular place, in the panhandle of the state, there was so much activity going on with slave auctions, particularly from the courthouse, from the jail, that they would advertise these sales down in Virginia, and that area was called Little Virginia. So we have this image of the convention in Cazenovia in New York, and I want to point out the two young ladies, one standing beside Frederick Douglass, the other standing beside Garrett Smith, and these are the Edmondson sisters. Again, thinking about power of place, and these two young ladies were from Montgomery County, Maryland. Their labor was leased out in Washington, D.C. They had several brothers. Their brothers had heard talk about a potential escape through D.C. on the Pearl and convinced their sisters to join them in that effort, along with several other people. At least 77 people attempted to escape from this area on the Pearl in Washington, D.C. The incident actually was thwarted. The event was actually thwarted. They weren't successful, but they were ultimately able to gain their freedom. And so here you see them at the convention for the Fugitive Slave Convention, which is really powerful, thinking about the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And this image of a young lady, Eliza Greenwell, is an image of a young lady who was enslaved in Leonardtown, Maryland, and she actually gained her freedom when she escaped to Philadelphia. And so we're really honored to be able to feature this very humanizing portrait of this young lady who was able to seize her freedom. And along with that ambrotype, you see a note that was attached that explains the story of Eliza Greenwell. We'll go to the next. Thank you. And so we think about people who are escaping from Maryland. We think about seizing freedom in this area. We think about enslavement in this area. But you'll see here we have a document that shows, this is also in our collection, that shows some of the rewards that were issued during that period. You think about, for example, I said those different iterations of the Fugitive Slave Act, and the people who were profiting off of capturing enslaved people, fugitives, people running for freedom, freedom seekers. But I also want to point out this document here. It is a pass for a free woman to visit her husband. And so that pass was used to visit her husband, who was also free. And this is very important because we think about, well, there was enslavement and there was freedom, but even there were those limits of freedom. And so the limits of freedom required that if you were free, you had to carry that pass to prove your freedom. If you did not have that freedom, you could be put up on the auction block. Next slide, please. Of course, we talk about the iconic, and I've mentioned Frederick Douglass, and I've mentioned Harriet Tubman, and I could not go by without mentioning Benjamin Banneker, and this ties in also with the power of place. So Benjamin Banneker, and all his brilliant self-taught, who wrote this almanac, and again, he used his voice as well. He sent an almanac to Thomas Jefferson declaring that, like himself, other African Americans are living, breathing, intelligent people who deserve their freedom. Thomas Jefferson said, "You are the exception, sir, I beg to differ," and refused to free those he enslaved during his lifetime, and also writing the Declaration of Independence while maintaining enslaved people. The other thing with Benjamin Banneker is thinking about his efforts to help create the nation's capital. So you have this free black man, he was born free, who helped create the nation's capital, design the nation's capital. Again, proximity to power, the power of place. So Benjamin Banneker, his contributions to the nation and establishing the nation's capital, the layout, but you also have this image of some workers enslaved in Poolesville, Maryland, who were working in the Seneca quarries. The Seneca quarry is where we see quarried materials coming out and being used to build the nation's capital, the Capitol building, as well as the Smithsonian Castle. And so again, thinking about the contributions of enslaved people to building the nation, and enslaved people who are here in this location in Maryland, and being in such close proximity to power, such close proximity to voices of freedom and liberation, such close proximity to where decisions were being made with the American Colonization Society, as well as being in close proximity to where there were regular occurrences of slave auctions right by the place where the nation's legislation was being created. Next slide, please. We can't talk about Maryland without talking about, again, the role of the Catholic Church. And so you see in this image in the middle, an image of Frank Campbell from 1900 from Louisiana. Frank Campbell was one of the 272 individuals sold by Georgetown University down to Louisiana. Many of those 272 individuals originate from the Maryland area. And the Jesuit Church being part of contributing to the development, the building of Georgetown University. Here we have the image of the Sacred Heart Church in White Marsh in Prince George's County. And some of you are probably aware of most recently in the past 2 weeks that they've been discussing some of the 100+ burial sites that have been found at that White Marsh Church site. And it is currently being researched using ground-penetrating radar and more. So we'll be excited to find out more about that history as well. Also, next to that, you see an image of a business letter. Now, I put this here because I wanted to think about the significance of slavery and profit and power. Profit and power juxtaposed against the human cost. So that letter, profit and power, while the woman who's writing the letter to one of her clients, She may be just working class. She may be just someone who owned a business. That business happened to be part of the slave trade business. Her business provided instruments of torture, provided fabric to clothe enslaved people down on plantations in the South. And so she's writing to one of her clients saying that, well, we couldn't send the whip this time, but we will send it in another package. We had a couple that we ordered on your behalf. And when you flip over the page, you see where the measurements are put aside with the individuals who will be receiving fabric so that they can have clothing on the plantation site. You think about the Jesuits who owned about 13,000 acres of land. You think about Archbishop Carroll, who's founded Georgetown University with the support of the Catholic community in Maryland. You think about Frank Campbell, who was one of the 272 people of value to Georgetown University and sent down to Louisiana. And you think about this woman in this letter and the legacies for each. So even that woman who engaged in the retail trade associated with the transatlantic slave trade, even if she wasn't a wealthy planter, what did she gain from that? Did she have children? Did it afford an opportunity for her to send her own children to some of these esteemed universities? Next slide, please. This, of course, is the Smithsonian Castle, built with some of the stones that were acquired in that Seneca quarry. If we go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And this is a manumission receipt for Vister Campbell, who enlisted in the Union Army. Again, Maryland was a border state, didn't end slavery until 1864. And with this manumission receipt, his enslaver was actually petitioning for reimbursement for the loss of his services during that period. Next slide, please. So I thought about the 1856 project, and just to bring it into context with the timeline, and thinking about all of what's been going on here at this campus. 1856, the founding of the Maryland Agricultural College. 2006, what prompted some of this early on, the 150th anniversary. And, you know, hats off for turning the mirror around and reflecting on this history. And then 2009, knowing our history, African American slavery and the University of Maryland, directed by, guided by the renowned Dr. Ira Berlin. His brilliance had a great impact on how we created the Slavery and Freedom exhibition in the museum. So you all should be very proud about the thumbprint from the University of Maryland on an exhibition that has been so well received. And then, of course, this is very important. Dr. Berlin didn't create that report by himself. It took the students in his History 429 class. And this is very important. We'll revisit that in a moment. And then 2020, Dr. Herbert Brewer, who issued the challenge to dig a little deeper with his lecture on what made College Park possible. And thank God someone accepted the challenge. And so here you see in 2020, the University of Maryland joins the University Studying Slavery Initiative, and we get the official 1856 project. Next slide, please. So I had this kind of thought cloud when I was reading about the 1856 project. And you see these words that float to the top. Now, you know, we go to services and everything, and someone says, read quietly to yourself, but I'm going to read this out loud. Blueprint for richer understanding of generations of racialized trauma, rooted in the institution, restorative justice, moral accountability, reconciliation, diverse and inclusive spaces, embrace the past, liberated future. You remember when I threw up the vision here from my museum and I had in bold letters what our vision is? This is a powerful vision, right? And so these words should resonate with you and should be front of mind as you think about the connections to slavery and why should we even learn this history? Why should we learn this history? Who cares about moral accountability? Why should we learn this history? Who cares about diverse and inclusive spaces? Look around this room. I see a lot of different faces. Gender, race, age. Who cares about a liberated future? Next slide, please. This is some of the work that we did in putting together the Slavery and Freedom exhibition at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. My colleague and I traveled down to Edisto Island, South Carolina, and we worked with the local community down there, the local residents, but very importantly, we worked with the descendants of the enslaved and the descendants of the enslavers. We met with both groups because they all claim each other down there. At one point, we were waiting for one of the descendants of the enslaved to come by as we collected that slave cabin, and it was taken apart piece by piece over the course of a week, and organic conversations started happening on site as people recounted the history, and we were able to capture some of that history as it informed how we were going to interpret that object. And while we were waiting for one of the descendants of the enslaved, we saw a truck coming down the road, and out of the truck steps the descendant of the enslaving family and the descendant of the enslaved community members speaking Gullah to each other. At the same time, there was a young lady who, may she rest in peace, she was with us, and she was pivotal in helping to bring together a cross-section of people, of descendants of the enslaved community members. And her name was Arlene. And Arlene was beautiful, heavy-set, brown skin, piercing blue eyes. And she looked like the woman you see in the orange blouse on your far left. That's Carol. And Arlene said to me, look, Carol said that we're related and she wants to talk to me about that. I really don't want to talk to her. And I said, so, if you all are related, she has stuff that you may not have. And she is likely looking for information that you might have. So you might consider talking with her. And next thing I know, I see a truck coming down the road, dust flying everywhere, and two people get out of the truck, and Arlene looks shocked. And I said, why do you look so shocked? She said, I went with Carol to her house, and she asked me about my family. And I told her my brother's doing the research now, and she pulled out a book and threw it on the table and said, well, here's the other half of your family's information. Let me know when you get the information so I can learn more about my family. And they had been on a journey ever since we were down there that day. And sadly, Arlene passed away before the museum opened, and Gretchen and Carol were there with her the day that she passed away. It is a complex situation to think about how we are connected. My own family indeed has ancestors who are Caucasian, but I personally do not claim that, mindful that it was born out of rape. But there are some people who sit down and have talked through this and have discussed this history and learned more about each side of the family. We'll go to the next slide, please. In addition to the house on Edisto Island, that was the slave cabin from Point-au-Pines Plantation, which is featured in the Slavery and Freedom exhibition, we have the Hutchinson House. The Hutchinson House was in the family of the Hutchinson family that is connected to that slave cabin. You'll see some of the descendants up top here, Greg Estevez, which is Arlene's brother, who actually did write his book. And so you see Greg with Carol here in this bottom image, and the community worked together to preserve this original Reconstruction era home that was produced in the 1880s by their ancestor. The home was in disrepair, and the gentleman you see walking the grounds, John, I forget his last name, I do apologize. He's brilliant. He's the head of the Edisto Island Open Land Trust, and they came in, wrote for a grant. They were able to get money to restore the home, and they've been working with college students from the University of Charleston to help restore the home and bring it back to its former self, but also work with the descendants to talk about how the home will be used, in particular to use it as a site for education on Reconstruction in the area. We'll go to the next slide, please. Some of you may have seen the recent documentary on Descendant. It is about Africatown and finding the Clotilda and the legacies of slavery down in Africatown, Mobile, Alabama. I was part of the team that went down to do community engagement as well as work with the maritime divers to try and identify and locate the Clotilda slave ship. And so we were able to work in the community, speak to community members at churches, as well as work with community elders to speak with young people at the local schools so they can see the importance of their own history and also see people like myself and my colleague, this gentleman here, Kamal Siddiqui, who is a black diver. So they can think about the history, but also think about career opportunities that is very important to telling their own story. We'll go to the next slide, please. Here's the image of the descendant. You see this image here, the historic image of Cudjo Lewis, whose story is featured in the book written by Zora Neale Hurston that was recently published in 2018. I highly recommend you all watch the recent documentary that was released on Zora Neale Hurston. Proud to say that that was produced by Maryland Public Television. And so as we go to the next slide, please, and thank you for adjusting the slides for me. Our work continues also down in St. Croix, the U.S. Virgin Islands. We work with the team. This project is called the Slave Wrecks Project, and we work with teams around the world to think a little more deeply about the history of slavery through the lens of maritime archaeology. And so we are training divers in Senegal, in Dakar, Senegal. We're working with young people at the University of the Virgin Islands. At the University of Dakar, we're meeting with members of the Rotary Club as well as with descendant community members. The thing that folks said to us down in St. Croix is, what we want is for you not to just be in our backyard looking at slave ships potentially, not to just come in and harvest our history, but we want it to be used in a way that we can become more economically viable. And so what we did was we created internships. What we did was we funded $15,000 seed grant for an archaeological dig at a local plantation site. The young man who headed up that dig actually was able to turn that grant into a $200,000 grant. And so he's able to bring students in from across the country, take them to UCLA, train them, and then carry them out to St. Croix. Room and board is paid for, and then send them back home, plus they get a $3,000 a month stipend. If they decide to go and pursue a PhD, and they complete that program, they can actually get a free PhD at UCLA. There is one young lady who's doing that now. So, next slide, please. So why is this important? Well, I think we've talked about some of that already. We have to do more inclusive storytelling. And I want to say this, when I say descendant community, it's not a buzzword for Black people. Descendants are descendants of Black people enslaved and free, descendants of indigenous people held in bondage and free, descendants of white people, poor white people, yeoman white farmers, planter elite. We have to look into all of these stories because what happened to one impacted the other. Create opportunities, like I just mentioned, opportunities for career training, opportunities for jobs, opportunities to learn how to swim, right? Prompt, thoughtful, and thought-provoking dialogue across race, gender, location. Conduct and promote preservation. Close the gap in the fields of history, archaeology, preservation, public history, archival work. All very important. Bring in new perspectives and insights. I'm going to tell you this one short story. There was a young lady who was doing a fellowship at the Smithsonian with my museum, and she talked about how enslaved people who had escaped to freedom would oftentimes take a piece of the plantation with them, maybe a shard from a piece of a plate or what have you. And she said that it was a way for them to keep their enslaver close to them. And I said, look, my grandmother has a trunk at home, and there was a picture in the trunk. And it's of a woman, a white woman, who's sitting, holding a cocktail, throwing her head back, laughing, looking very joyful. And I looked at that picture. I was like, who is this? And she said, oh, that's the woman who I cleaned her house for 50 years. She made me take that picture. Someone else could walk in there, see that trunk, and have all kinds of interpretation about that picture. It's important to have different insights, new perspectives, to think about the different ways people would be thinking about these items, right? These stories. Prioritizing community voices, prioritizing funding and resources to support projects focused on slavery, and please forgive me, I forgot to put "and freedom." Engage, educate, and empower. What's the point of doing this history work? What's the point of informing people? Has anyone here seen the film Descendant? And you think about the legacies of slavery, and you think about the significance of environmental racism and industrial encroachment, and how the history helps draw a direct line as a legacy of slavery, and how it allows us to think more deeply about how we can end this. And then create a new understanding and new tools to what? Support and advancement. Provide support and advancement for those who have for so long been marginalized despite their contributions to the development of this nation, the development of this region, the development of this state, the development of this university. Now, with that said, I know that it was a unique situation or an interesting situation when Charles Calvert aligned with Mr. Hallwell, who was the first president of the university, and said, don't include enslaved laborers as part of building this university. But like I mentioned, the woman who was selling whips and fabric, like I mentioned, when we think about the Jesuits who had at least 13,000 acres of land that was being cultivated by enslaved people, that was their support and advancement. It's 2023. This history will help us to think more deeply about support and advancement to help rectify these legacies of slavery. And so, again, it is my pleasure to speak to you about why the 1856 project is so important. I'll close on this, if you wouldn't mind turning to the next slide, please. This is important that we share this history, make it accessible, invite people in, help people see themselves in this history. It's the American story, yes, told through the African American lens in my museum. Here is the American story. We're looking at slavery and freedom, and it is through many lenses, all associated with this history and with this institution. And so it's imperative that we make these stories accessible so that people can see themselves in the stories and see how their ancestors contributed to the founding of this nation, and also how this history still impacts us today. Next slide, please. This is my family. My dad's side of the family. My grandfather is the baby. This family was enslaved in South Carolina, carried to Mississippi, where they continued to be enslaved. They gained their freedom at the end of the Civil War, the passage of the 13th Amendment. They fought for their right to raise healthy families, to earn a fair wage, to actually get the money they were due at the end of the season when they were sharecropping. They fought for the right to vote, to enforce it. Ultimately, they had to fight all the way to the point of fighting off Klan members. They killed some Klan members and left in the middle of the night and went to Indian Territory, where they established a home in what became Oklahoma. There they owned a department store, a chain of department stores, a hotel, a theater, a bank, and they were members of the National Negro Business League. And they were community leaders, and all those kids, graduated from Langston University. So they made a way out of no way, and the majority of them had their graduate degrees as well. But I want to go to the next slide. This woman here, Maggie Barnes, is my great-great-grandmother. Next to her, Mattie Floyd is my great-grandmother. Next to her, Rosa May, is my grandmother. And next to her is my mother, Ruby. Let me tell you about these women. Maggie Barnes was born during Reconstruction. Her family was a group of sharecroppers. They had formerly been enslaved. Maggie Barnes was raped by one man, his brother, and his cousin. One of those brothers is the father of my grandmother, Mattie Floyd. Mattie Floyd had children starting at age 14, including my grandmother, Rosa May Rogers. Mattie Floyd was a sharecropper. My grandmother hated picking cotton, so she found a way to work in the house. And the sharecropper, landowner, loaned her money when she got accepted to Mary Allen College in Texas for young colored women, as they were called. Unfortunately, after her first year, she had to have an appendectomy, and she couldn't borrow any more money. She had to use it for the surgery. And so Rosa May is the woman who had the trunk with the picture of the woman whose house she cleaned for over 50 years. Because she couldn't finish her nursing degree, she went on to become a housekeeper. And I'm very proud to tell her story because my grandmother, Rosa, refused to let my mother or her sister work in anyone's house. My Aunt Mattie, who's not pictured here, went on to become one of the top pharmacists in Houston, Texas, and also at age 50 went on to get her law degree. And she still practices pharmaceutical work as well as has her own law practice. And my mother still holds the top score on the test for physical therapy licensing in the state of Oklahoma. So I say this to you because all of those opportunities that were afforded people, support and advancement, think about the opportunities that people have missed and what support and advancement, opportunities for higher education, opportunities for careers, opportunities just to be free. It's important we study this history, not just to learn about the experiences of Black people, but to learn about ourselves and our own humanity. Next slide, please. And this is my cousin, who was so proud to see our family featured in the museum. So it's my pleasure to have delivered this keynote address, and I'm really proud of the 1856 project, so thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary, for that powerful keynote speech. I think we have time for at least one or two questions. If there is anyone from the audience who would like to go up to the mic. And, And while I let people think about that, I'd like to ask you a question, Mary. Listening to your powerful story and your knowledge made me think about the ways that this history and it unites us in understanding and possibly motivates us to take action in the future toward a more just future. But I also remember that lately there is much opposition to this type of work. And I'm wondering if you could give us some advice about, you talked about the importance of the work, but how do we strengthen our resolve to resist this type of opposition?
For me, anyone can say anything to me, I'm still gonna do the work. So that's how I look at it. As my mom said to me when someone asked me to apply for this position, she said, Mary, you were doing this for free and you probably would have still done it for free anyway. And she's right. If you cut me, I bleed this stuff. So I'm just, it's part of who I am. And the thing that I think is important about where we are right now, politically, socially, is it's forcing us to take a deeper look at where we are. For so long, people may have had these, rose-colored glasses on. We're a post-racial, country. And this history ebbs and flows, right? We see what happened after Reconstruction, right? Or after all these black men were elected into office and black people gained their freedom. We saw what happened during the Civil Rights Movement. This is another time and another fight, but the fight continues, right? I tell people, no matter what happens, I'm still gonna wake up black in America and the fight continues. So, and my fight is my fight for everyone. It's not just for me. Because I could ask anyone here, how would you feel if you couldn't sit next to that person you're next to? How would you feel if you couldn't live next door to that person you live next to? How would you feel if you couldn't go out for drinks and sit with your friend? The fight continues. And the other thing I will add is, it's so important that at this time, it's prompting us to think more deeply about freedom, about democracy, and things that sometimes people take for granted.
I see we have someone at the mic. I'm Dr. Holly Brewer.
Someone else too, but I guess he left. Hi, I'm a historian here at Maryland, and my question for you is, how can we collaborate better between the University of Maryland and the African American History Museum? National Museum of African American History and Culture. You talked about the role that Ira Berlin played in its origins, and he is amazing, and we all miss him. We've got a lot of scholars here at the university who still work on questions related to slavery. What can we do to increase bonds of cooperation now that he's passed, in 2018?
Well, for me, I'm excited to finally be able to catch my breath because I was working on so many large projects, and 2022 was supposed to be the year of Mary. Don't laugh. But it was supposed to be a time to recalibrate and really start focusing on public programs, not just, doing exhibitions. And so as the curator of American slavery, I'm here. And through April, I have a few things I'm working on, but I will follow up with folks, and I would love to continue the conversation and see what we can do, especially with the 250th anniversary of the founding of the nation coming up.
So exciting, thank you.
Because we're here at the University of Maryland, I'm sure that there are people in the audience who are either historians or archivists or librarians, people, either those roles or aspiring to be. And I think some of them might want to know, what advice would you give to those who want to do similar research that you've done?
Well, the thing with me is she knows this. I came to my position in a roundabout way. I don't have my PhD. I have my law degree. Though I desperately am looking forward to getting my PhD. I met with Bonnie Thornton Dill while she was here, and I ended up being admitted to Howard. But as you know, we have to pay for things ourselves, so it's slow going, but it's going, and I love it. I love the study of this history. And so for me, I got into this doing family history. And the truth is, that family you saw from Oklahoma, when they left in 1890 out of Mississippi, for so long, we had family reunions every 2 years, and no one really talked extensively about Mississippi. And so no one had really been back since 1890. And I happened to have some primary source materials that provided information on where the family was. And I actually went out to Oktibbeha County, Mississippi, not knowing anyone, and literally pulling up to a gas station and said, the first black person I see, I'm going to ask them, do you know where this is? And it turned into a whole research project. It wasn't just a family history research project. I found the church where there was a confrontation between African American voters and the red shirts. And I found the plantation sites where people were enslaved, and I found the churches and the schools that they attended. And so I think that you can come at this history in many different ways, but it is imperative to pursue that degree. The law degree gave me the skills for research analysis and writing. The PhD I'm really excited about for really training me in that discipline to really do that scholarly writing and so much more, yeah.
Have someone at the mic, please. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Laura. She, her pronouns. I'm a library and information science master's candidate here. Hi, Dean Lim. I was hoping to kind of bounce off of Dean Lim's question and get a bit more specific. For those of you who might be watching this recording back and need a visual description, I am so white that I get a sunburn from my desk lamp. And so I was wondering, how can someone like me who comes from a position of white privilege and does not have the, well, direct historical connection, because when you think about it, we all have a historical connection to this, how can I, if I want to research this going forward or volunteer at your museum or do something to help uncover more of the narrative, how can I do so without stepping on the toes of the community who should be at the forefront of this?
That's a great question, and I'll tell you right off the bat, listening to you talk about your major, historically there have been black people, for example, in churches and different organizations who have been the heritage stewards of this history, but they may not necessarily know about creating a filing system. They may not necessarily know about certain approaches to how to do the research. They may not necessarily know about some of the resources that can be found in these libraries and other repositories, right? And so you would bring that skill set to the table, and they will bring with them information, the history, and you will help with organizing that, help them think through it. Now, granted, there are a lot of librarians and educators in a lot of these churches, right? But it's still a matter of everyone has something that they can contribute to the effort. So don't ever think don't ever sell yourself short. You bring something to the effort. And the other thing is that this type of stuff creates opportunities to promote these very important dialogues. It's an exchange of information. You're learning about, like I said, you learn about the community members, you learn about descendants, you learn about the history, but in so doing, think about how you're learning about yourself. I said to Dean Lim, in the exhibition, we have the section on domestic slave trade, and one of the things we think about is we don't want people to just look at that story and go, wow, that's awful what happened to that Black mother and child, but instead look at it and go, wow, that's awful. What would I do if that were my child? And so you're learning along the way, and look at your own story. Think about how you would feel. Think about how your family may be different, and what did that mean, which you've already acknowledged, you know? So I think it's very important that we all stay engaged in this. Thank you. Thank you.
Unfortunately, and I do see someone else who would like to ask a question, but we are short of time, so my apologies there. But I do want to thank you again, Mary, for a wonderful speech and very motivational. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
And I would like to present you with some small tokens of our affection and gratitude.
This
Thank
is a
you.
great token. I'm going to Martha's Vineyard in August, and this is going to be my beach bag. Thank you.
You all just want to stay there for one moment? Okay, can we have another round of applause for our wonderful keynote and moderator? Okay, before we go to intermission, if you can go a few more slides. Oh, there we go. We want to recognize our special guests who've been supportive of the James Clark School of Engineering, all here at the University of Maryland, our College of Education, the iSchool, School of Public Policy, Office of Undergraduate Studies, the School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. So thank you, special guests. I know you're here with us and will continue to support us. And just one more slide before intermission. Okay, you're going to see this QR code a lot today, so this won't stay up long, but do know we want to hear from you. We want to know how you enjoyed the program, what perhaps needs tweaking, what you'd like to see in the future. So if you're staying with us, perhaps you can do this at the end of the program, but if you are unfortunately having to leave during intermission, if you can capture this QR code, which is also available at the registration desk, please do so. And two more notes of appreciation. Our cultural heritage sponsors are Anacostia Trails Heritage Area and the Prince George's Heritage Incorporated. So thank you. Today, right now, will be the shortest intermission. Unfortunately, we only have about 3 minutes to give you. So you might want to stay seated, but I promise the next intermission will be longer. So run out or stay here. So thank you. Okay.
Thanks,
All right.
Kim.